There's that. Good. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to talk for about 50 minutes. I'm hoping that's about right. And the talk is a mixture of some very ambitious big ideas and some very nerdy details on a particular way that we might measure the sense of agency. So I'm going to go from the very top to the really depths of psychometric nerdy stuff in order to talk about sense of agency. I'm not going to show any acknowledgements at the end because I'm really reviewing about 25 years of work, and there are just too many people who did all the work for me to really remember and thank them all individually. And what I'm going to try and do in the next 50 minutes is say, what is the sense of agency? How does it work? How can we measure it? And who cares? What have we learned? So that's all we need to do. So first of all, what is the sense of agency? So here is a nice quote from Ludwig Wittgenstein. What is left over if I subtract the fact that my arm goes up from the fact that I raise my arm? Okay, it's odd. I'm going to read it again. What is left over if I subtract the fact that my arm goes up from the fact that I raise my arm? So Wittgenstein thought this was a stupid question, and he actually told us not to ask this question. But I disagree. I think it's quite an interesting question, and I think it's a question that we might be able to answer scientifically. And I think one possible answer to Wittgenstein is the sense of agency. When I raise my arm, I feel that I am controlling the movement of my arm. I feel a sense of agency with respect to the way my arm moves. But if my arm goes up, for example, because somebody pushes it up, then I do not feel a sense of agency. So that's the difference. What is left over if I subtract the fact that my arm goes up from the fact that I raise my arm is the sense of agency. So a more formal definition of the sense of agency is the sense of agency is the feeling that one controls one's own actions and through them events in the outside world. So notice that there are these two elements, controlling one's own actions and through them events in the outside world. And it's quite interesting to think about this problem developmentally. If you look at a newborn baby doesn't seem to have a lot of control. It has a lot of movement, but it's difficult to see that it really has a lot of control. The movements appear random or fairly random. And somehow we are not like that. We are more in control of our own actions and events in the outside world than this wonderful person. But we can't remember what it was like to be her or him. We can't remember what it was like not to have agency. So one of the problems with the sense of agency is that it's so much part of our everyday mental life that it's very difficult to realize that we have it and to understand what it is. It's a bit like oxygen, it's just always there. And here is an interesting person who could only make movements with his left foot. So he wrote a book called My Left Foot, which became a very good film. I recommend the film, also called My Left Foot. He had cerebral palsy, and he really was treated like an object for the first 7 years of his life. And he can remember the first time he ever made a functional action. Suddenly, I wanted desperately to do what my sister was doing. Without thinking or knowing exactly what I was doing, I reached out and took the stick of chalk. The children are drawing on the floor. Took the stick of chalk out of my sister's hand with my left foot. So he can remember the first time he ever did anything. First time he decided, thought, wanted, willed, controlled, acted, and achieved anything in his life. He can remember what it was like not to have agency, and then what it became like to have agency. And interestingly, his his mental life starts at this point when he was about 8. We discover a sense of agency in early life. We typically do not remember our early pre-agentic state, and the sense of agency both accompanies and enables our entire mental life, if we are lucky enough to be healthy human adults, right? So this doesn't perhaps apply to people with various psychiatric conditions. So we have this thing called the sense of agency, which is so ever present that it's hard to see. But when we think about it, we can see that it's really, really important. So sense of agency is a subjective experience. It's a feeling of being in control, but it's of enormous societal and historical importance. So let's think about agriculture. So what you need to do in agriculture is you need to take the seed, you need to put it in the field, and then 6 months later, you can have something to eat, right? So in order for agriculture to work, you have to understand the relationship between planting the seed and eating the dinner 6 months later. You need to understand that your actions have some control in the outside world. Technology is all about agency, so we're able to extend the impact of our actions on the outside world by using tools. We're able to use those tools to build even more tools, and we're able to create modern technologies. All human societies that I'm aware of have some kind of idea that individual people are responsible for the outcomes of their actions. They have some kind of idea of responsibility, and we have legal systems which basically mean that these people here can tell this person here whether they've done something good or bad, and they will be punished or praised accordingly. So these are some of the enormous ways in which our sense of agency drives our lives. It's really interesting if you look at consciousness science. Consciousness science is fantastic. It's very good at studying human subjectivity, but they study Gabor patch, right? And sense of agency is another conscious experience. It's the experience of controlling your actions and through them events in the outside world, but it seems a bit more important than a Gabor patch. That's one of the reasons why I think it's worth studying. So there are lots of comments on sense of agency. Here's one from Karl Marx. Philosophers have described the world, the point is to change it. That's a good example of sense of agency. Here's another lovely one. This is from Roosevelt. And it's conventional for the President of the United States to give a talk to the graduating class in some university. And this is a very nice speech that he gave in 1932, in which he says to people who are becoming adults and going out into the world, above all, try something. You know, this is this idea that you can change the world. So these are just parts of the ways that we should care about sense of agency. Now let's think about what does it work. Let's think less about the impact and more about the science. So an easy way to start is to think about sense of agency related to our intentional actions. So we form intentions about what we want to do. We make actions by moving our body, and through our actions, we're able to produce outcomes in the external world. So we can think of everything that happens before the action as being the process of volition, what philosophers call free will, except it's not a very good term. And we can use the word agency to describe the relationship between the action and the outcome. So we're really interested in how do we make things happen? How can we control what happens? How can we situate the sense of agency within this chain from what we want to do through to what actually happens? And probably there are a couple of mechanisms which are really, really important here. So the first one is a fairly familiar one of prediction. So this is the kind of computational model which is sort of widely used to describe how action processing works in the nervous system. It comes in different flavors, but I'll explain the sort of standard one. So you start off with some sort of representation of what you want to achieve. You need to represent the counterfactual goals. I want to be rich, or I want to go to the airport. So you have to have some goal in order to justify your action. And when you have a goal, you need to plan how you're going to achieve it. So the first thing that you need is some way of selecting which of the infinite number of possible things that you can do is actually going to make your goal happen. So I can do lots of things, but only some of them are going to make me rich. Only some of them are going to get me to the airport. And only after you've planned what you're going to do can you start to send motor commands to the muscles of your body and your limbs that actually translate your thoughts into action. So if we first of all think about what happens once you start to move, that will have effects in the outside world, and you can learn about the effects of your actions through sensory information. You have a comparator here, which can compare whether the current sensory information corresponds to your goal or not, and keep going around the negative feedback loop until you achieve your goal. And the insight of computational modeling is that rather than going around this slow external feedback loop through the physical world, it's important to take a copy of your motor command, to run it through an internal predictor, sometimes called a forward model, and to predict, given the motor command that I've just sent, what's going to happen? Given that I'm walking in this direction, will I get to the airport? Given that I've paid all my taxes, am I really going to get rich? So you need to constantly make internal predictions about whether you're heading in the right way towards the goal or not. And the relevance to sense of agency is that if you can predict the likely consequences of your actions, you can take the output of this forward model and you can compare what you predict is going to happen with what the external world sensory feedback loop tells you has actually happened. If you compare what you think will happen with what actually happens, you can work out whether you did it or not. So if my goal is to lift my arm up into the air, I suddenly get sensory feedback that my hand is up above my head, I can say, oh, well, actually, Patrick, don't worry, this is exactly what you wanted. You've achieved your goal. You wanted to raise your arm, and the muscles in your, the muscle feedback from your limb is telling you that your arm is in the air. So this is the idea that sense of agency really depends on checking whether what happens matches the consequences of the predicted consequences of your own movement. Seems extremely intuitive. It's a very powerful model in computational neuropsychology. And it faces a challenge from a completely different interpretation of sense of agency, which suggests that we don't actually predict the consequences of our own actions at all. We just monitor what happens and we make up interpretations to explain what goes on. So this is a model which is favored in philosophy and in social psychology. So the two Daniels here, unfortunately, neither with us any longer, Daniel Dennett and Daniel Wegner, have proposed that we don't really have any conscious sense of agency at all, but we make up stories. Our unconscious brain activity causes our actions. Our actions have consequences in the external world, and we retrospectively post-dict. Post-diction is the opposite of prediction. We retrospectively post-dict a feeling that the action is our own to make sense of all the stuff that happens. So the way that this works is I notice my hand is in the air. I hadn't expected it to be up there, but now that I see it there, I say, oh, well, okay, maybe you're trying to ask a question, or maybe you're trying to reach the buttons on the projector because there's some technical problem. So the idea here is that general cognition is always trying to make sense of the world. And we're trying to make sense of what we do in the same way as we do it. We're trying to retrospectively justify or give stories to explain the things that we do. This is really important because if you believe in motor prediction, then you're really in control. If you believe in interpretive post-diction, then you just are telling yourselves illusory stories about being in control, and you're not really. So the implications for responsibility, for example, are major. Hello.
Hi. In the second interpretation, is there any place for the notion of a goal or a prior intention?
It's interestingly not in the way that these thinkers have described it. And I think perhaps one of the limitations is that most of the evidence for the interpretive post-diction idea comes from sort of experiments in the social psychology tradition. And in an experiment, the experimenter gives the goal to the participant. So the experiments are funny. It's difficult to get real goals into experiments, but it's a good point. Okay, so I've now described the sort of two broad psychological theories, and we want to decide which theory is correct, and that means we need to collect data, and that means we need to have measures of sense of agency, right? So there's no point doing experiments unless you can measure something sensible and measure it well. And this turns out to be really tricky. So measuring subjective experience is always difficult. History of psychology shows us that. And there are two broad traditions of measuring subjective experience of any kind, not just sense of agency, but of any kind. And it's worth just taking this next slide in a fairly tutorial way, because it applies to lots of things. So the first thing is you can ask people directly about what their subjective experience is. That's an explicit measure. Tell me what you're thinking, feeling, perceiving right now. And this is a direct question. It's got very high surface validity. It seems like it's obviously the right thing to do if you're interested in the mind and experience. It has the problem that it requires like linguistic communication. So a lot of experiences are quite hard to put into words, right? So you go to the doctor and you try to describe your pain. It's quite hard. One of the real problems that we never talk about is if you ask people questions about their experience, I think they normally don't understand you. So as an experimenter, we tend to ask these deeply complicated experiments. I used to do some work in the experience of your own body, and people ask questions like, do you feel a sense of body ownership in questionnaires? And I think the participants just assume that we're all nuts. I mean, the questions we ask are just really bad. And the other problem about asking direct questions is that, particularly if people don't understand the question, they really want to give the right answer. So participants just say things which have desirability biases. So the alternative is to not ask people direct questions, but to use indirect or proxy measures, so-called implicit measures. This helps to avoid biases, but and it makes it harder for the participant to sort of help the experimenter by trying to say the right thing. And this is the approach that we've taken to the sense of agency. So the explicit tradition to sense of agency basically asks questions like, did you do that? Did you put your hand in the air? Did you steal the biscuits? Did you pull the trigger? All these kinds of questions, which we're quite familiar with. And the alternative that I want to describe now is the idea that instead of asking a direct question, we can ask people about time perception, because time perception turns out, I think, to be an interesting way to study the sense of agency. That's not new. So here is Hermann Helmholtz, who told us 150 years ago that neural activities take measurable time. So he was the first person to realize that a really good question in psychology is when. And his pupil, Wilhelm Wundt, went on to show that neural processing delays influence the time at which we have experiences. So the time of our subjective experience is, if you like, a readout of the brain mechanisms which generate our subjective experience and tell us about the contents. And I love history, so the 19th century has this interesting sort of marriage between the scientific study of mind and instrumentation physics. So the hip chronoscope, which was originally built in order to time the amount, to measure the amount of time it took for an artillery shell to leave the gun and explode, turned out to be very useful for measuring when people have experiences, because you could press a button when the stimulus happened, and then the participant could press another button when they see the stimulus or something like that. So you could have sub-second mental chronometry. And there's a long tradition of using this kind of when question to study the mind. So about 25 years ago, we started using when questions, mental chronometry, to study the sense of agency in very, very simple experiments where we asked people to make a voluntary action, such as pressing a button, which, there we are, we press the button, and pressing the button is a voluntary action which controls an event in the external world, because a short delay after you press the button, you hear a beep. So it's not really interesting. It's not like Karl Marx said, but you make an action and you slightly change the world by making that beep happen. So you're able to have agency over an event in the outside world, which is the beep. And while this is happening, you're watching a chronometer, you're watching a clock, and the clock is displayed on the screen, and it's got one hand, and it goes around every 2,560 milliseconds. So the clock really is not part of the experiment. The clock is like a ruler. It's like a way that you can report when you had particular subjective experiences. And the two subjective experiences we're interested in are the two defining experiences of the sense of agency, the experience of pressing the button and the experience of hearing the sound. So the clock rotates continuously. It stops at the end of the trial in a random location, and the participant is asked to report the clock position when they press the button, or in a separate block of trials when they heard the sound. So, for example, the person might say at the end of the trial, well, I think I pressed the button when the clock hand was at 23. We know where the clock hand was when they actually pressed the button, so we can look at the errors of their timing judgment. And that turns out to be quite informative. So, let me explain how. First of all, we're going to have a control condition where you don't do anything. You sit and watch the clock, and the computer plays a sound. So the sound occurs on this timeline, and then the clock continues to rotate. It stops after a while in a random position, and you're asked, when did you hear the sound? You have to report where was the clock position when you heard the sound. Now, people are not good at this. It's quite hard. Interestingly, they often think that the sound happened before it really happened, which might be odd, might be weird, might be interesting, but actually it's not that interesting for us. What we're really interested in is how does the perceived time of the sound change when we compare it to an agency block where we tell the participant, press the button when you feel like it, wait for the sound to happen, and then when the trial ends, tell us when you think you heard the sound. Because we can compare the perceived time of sounds that you've made out of your own agency and sounds that just happen, okay? And if we compare those, we've got a measure of the sense of agency. So the interesting finding is that the perceived time of sounds that you make through your own action, that you control, is shifted to be much, much earlier than the perceived time of an identical sound that just happens all by itself. So the important point is the difference in the perceived time of the sound, not the error in one single condition. It's the change in when you perceive things happen when you control them. Okay, everybody happy with that? So we call that the perceptual shift. We can do exactly the same thing now from the point of view of the action, because we can have a block of baseline control trials where you press the button and it has absolutely no effect on the outside world at all. But we can ask you, where was the clock hand when you think you pressed the button? People often think they pressed the button before they did. That might be interesting, but what's more interesting is if you ask the same question in an agency block where you press the button and it produces a sound, then there's a perceptual shift in the perceived time of the action, which is now in the opposite direction. It's forwards in time towards the outcome of the action that you produce. So if you're all happy with that, let's just quickly go through it, because this is going to be important for the next sort of 5 or 10 minutes. In reality, action and sound are separated by 250 milliseconds. The dashed lines here indicate our baseline, our participants' baseline judgments of when actions seem to occur when they happen by themselves and when sounds seem to occur when they happen by themselves. And we use those baselines to measure the shifts in milliseconds when the action is followed by the outcome and the outcome is caused by the action. And what I've done here is I've shifted the action and shifted the outcome by the data that we measured in our original experiment. So we perceive actions as shifted 15 milliseconds towards the outcome, and we perceive the outcome as shifted minus, notice the sign, 46 milliseconds earlier in time back towards the action that caused it. And if you look at the fact that these two shifts are happening in opposite directions, we don't directly measure the interval between them, but we can calculate that implicitly people must be perceiving the action outcome interval as shorter than it really is. People must be linking in their minds two things that are actually separated by 250 milliseconds, and they perceive them as separated by a quite considerably shorter period. Now, the Scottish philosopher David Hume would have said, I could have told you that in 1793, because agency is an example of causal control. My action causes the sound, and causation is perceived as association. It's the association between cause and effect. And for me, it seems very natural that when we perceive our own causal power, when we perceive our own association, what we're doing, our own agency, what we're doing is making associations between what we do and what happens. And that results in this temporal compression. What I haven't done at all is shown you that this is anything related to sort of my intention or my goal or me trying to change the world. I haven't yet shown that this is related to agency in the sense of will or decision. And to do this, what we need to do is we need to have a control condition which doesn't involve voluntary actions, but involves something else. And this is a much younger version of me. And this is a TMS coil, and this is a TMS machine, and this is a much younger version of my then postdoc. And what he's going to do is he's going to program the computer so that at a time decided by the computer, an electric current flows through the TMS coil, which induces electrical currents in the neurons of the motor cortex of the left hemisphere and results in a completely involuntary movement of the muscles of the right hand, which are exactly the same muscles that I would have used to press the button in a voluntary action condition. So the advantage of TMS is it allows us an access to the brain's motor systems, which is completely involuntary, but which is a roughly similar physical event. I think I won't take the time to show you the explanatory video of how TMS works, because I guess you all know. So I've shown you the top two conditions before, and on the bottom is what happens when you have an involuntary TMS-induced muscle twitch, which is followed by an identical tone 250 milliseconds later. And once again, we've got baseline conditions of twitches alone without tones and tones alone without twitches. And we can measure the perceptual shift in the perceived time of the twitch when it's followed by a sound compared to when it's not, and the perceptual shift in the perceived time of the sound when it's preceded by a twitch compared to when it's not. And the critical point to notice here is that when you make a voluntary action, you get this binding, this intentional binding of what you do with what happens. And when you just move, when your arm goes up, as it were, when your fingers just move involuntarily, you get the opposite. You get perceptual repulsion. And to me, what this suggests is that the brain is sort of saying, oh, Patrick, don't be fooled by that dodgy guy with his big TMS machine. This isn't you. You're not actually producing these hand movements, and these sounds that are following are not yours. Keep these things separate in your mind. Don't link them. These are not part of what you're doing. So the interaction here is significant, and the interaction arises because voluntary actions cause this compression of action and outcome, and in the absence of a voluntary motor command, that compression does not happen. Yeah, what's your question?
So is it right to interpret this as a post-dictive effect? Because if I understood correctly, when I make an action and there is no sound, it is perceived as earlier as when I make an action and there is a sound. So the sound post-dictively changes when I perceive my action. Is that right?
Yeah, I think we'll come on to that. Yeah, we will come on to that. So yes, each event changes the perception of the other event.
Yeah. So
and because the sound comes after the action, then that effect requires in part post-fiction. But there's going to be a slide which answers your question much better. Yeah, Felix.
Maybe with regard to that, have you done also the experiment with a little jitter, like about like 20 milliseconds in between, like between the action?
Right, that's a really good question. So in these kinds of questions, we always keep the interval between action and outcome exactly constant, and almost all of the experiments have used 250 milliseconds. I don't know why. That was the interval we first used. The idea is this is happening, should be happening at sensory motor timescale. People have asked whether you get binding for longer intervals, and you do, but as the interval gets longer, the binding tends to reduce, tends to get less. And that's exactly what David Hume would have said, because relation between cause and effect requires temporal contiguity. So causes must happen before their effects, and it's easier to detect causation when the effect immediately
The
follows.
problem is that on the other hand, it's likely that you just predict.
If you
and
jitter
that
the
you
interval,
get like this post-addiction.
if you jitter the interval, the binding effect goes down. So we both looked at, we've both increased the mean interval and we've increased the variability of the interval, and both effects, both manipulations reduce the binding effect. Yeah. Okay. So we've then got these two things which we can call action binding and outcome binding. Everybody happy with that? So I'm going to discuss a little bit more some of the things that we can do with this measure. But first, let's look at some of the reaction that people have made. So a lot of people have said that you get binding when you have two tones, or you get binding when you look at other people acting, or you get binding when, I don't know, a virtual hand throws a virtual ball, or, you know, all kinds of complicated experiments. And these experiments show that binding is not unique to agency. So distortions of time perception are indeed common. And David Hume would have told us that binding association is going to occur whenever you have two events that reliably occur together. So if you just make two actions, then you perceive them as closer than they are together. If you just listen to two beeps, beep, beep, you hear them as closer together than they really are. So nobody ever said that binding is unique to agency. Nobody ever said that. What people, or some people, perhaps including me, said is that there's something about making intentional actions which produces outcomes, which increases the perception of association. So it's a change in the perception of association associated with agency. And a lot of people are unhappy about implicit measures. A lot of people don't like implicit measures, and they say, oh, that's not really what we mean by sense of agency. I feel a sense of agency over the cakes that I bake and the life that I lead, and there's something sort of full and rich and phenomenally satisfactory about my sense of agency, and you're just reducing it to a stupid clock, and you're missing the point, and so on. So this is fine. This is absolutely correct. Binding is just a proxy measure. It's just something that you can do in the lab. I think it's useful because explicit measures of sense of agency are pretty tricky. They're pretty problematic. It's not easy to do them well. And this kind of worry, I think, is almost, it's not clear whether it's a criticism of the theoretical construct of agency or whether it's just a criticism of how you measure it. So those are just some of the reactions that one can have to the idea of intentional binding. But if we put those to one side, I'm going to just take one more slide and then take some questions. We put those to one side. We've got a system of measurement that we can now use to do some experimental investigations of how the sense of agency works. We've got a tool. It's not a perfect tool. We've got a measure. It's not a perfect measure, but we can use it. And one of the things that we can do is we can ask, what is the division of labor between the predictive and the post-predictive elements? And the first way that we did this was to use a probabilistic experiment in which we varied the probability of the tone given the action. So we had one block of trials where you pressed the button, and on 50% of the trials at random, it was followed 250 milliseconds later by the tone. And in the other half of the trials, the tone never happened. Okay. And we had another block of trials. Oh, no, we've got some data. So the data is that you can't look at the tone binding in this experiment because half the time there's no tone, but you can look at the action binding. So you can ask people, where was the clock hand when you think you pressed the button? And you can see how it varies between these two conditions. So here are some numbers in milliseconds. You get bigger binding of actions towards tones when the tones happen compared to when they don't. Okay, so this effect must be a postdictive or reconstructive effect in which the occurrence of the tone retrospectively changes how you perceive the action. What you can then do is have another block of trials where you have a high or higher probability of the tone given the action, because now when you press the button, 75% of the time you're going to hear the tone, and only 25% of the time are you not going to hear the tone. And what you find here is it is quite interesting, because you find a shift in the perceived time of the action towards the tone, which is actually statistically equal whether the tone happens or doesn't. And if you compare the no tone conditions here, that difference must be due to the greater predictability of the tones in the lower block compared to the higher block. Okay, so there's clearly a predictive effect as well. And the idea would be that maybe all the time that we're making any, we're using our agency, we're constantly predicting and then probably also reconstructing as well. Interestingly, when we did exactly this experiment in a group of schizophrenic patients and a group of matched controls, what we found is here are the schizophrenic patients, and if you can see here, this is the action, and this is the perceived time of the action when the tone, on the 50% of trials where the tone occurs, and on the 50% of the trials where no tone occurs. So the difference, let me see, the difference here between the tone occurring and not occurring is the reconstruction. And if we look at healthy controls here, we can see that there's a difference between the perceived time of action when they predicted a tone would occur, but it actually doesn't, and they didn't so much predict that a tone would occur because there's only a 50% probability. So you've got these two mechanisms, reconstruction, which seems to be what the schizophrenics use, and prediction, which seems to be what the healthy controls use. Both of them actually show the binding of the action towards the outcome, but for different reasons. In one case, because the outcome happened, and the other case, because they knew it would happen or thought it would happen. So this is the dissociation in the schizophrenic patients in orange and the controls in green of the predictive and reconstructive components of intentional binding. And the perfect crossover interaction shows that you can have this sense of agency if you're schizophrenic, but you have it based on what happens, not on your prediction of what you think is going to happen. This is perhaps quite an interesting clinical point. I'm going to give you, I think, just one more example of the kinds of experiments that you can do with intentional bindings. This is the work of Michiko Yoshie, and she had blocks of trials where you press a button and you get a beep, and you can see the binding of the action towards the beep and the binding of the beep back towards the action. And then she had some more interesting trials where you press a button, you get an expression of joy or happiness, or you get an expression of fear and disgust. That one I deliberately made quieter because it's a little bit scary. I don't know if you heard it or if you need to play it again. So these are human vocalizations, which we shorten to as quick as possible, to 700 milliseconds. And once again, we can make these vocalizations the consequences of pressing the button, and we can ask people, when did you hear the onset of the sound? And what you can see is that you get very strong action binding and outcome binding, in fact, massive for happy and nice things. And you get much less action binding and outcome binding for unpleasant things. And for neutral things, it's something in between. So there's something about the valence of what happens which seems to profoundly influence the sense of agency. And this is quite interesting because we know this from explicit judgment. So if something goes horribly wrong, like if your paper is rejected by Nature Neuroscience, then you're going to blame your co-authors. You're going to say, well, it wasn't me, it was because my supervisor insisted on analyzing it with SPM. That's why the paper was rejected. And you'll feel that you'll sort of decrease your sense of agency. Whereas if the paper is welcomed with open arms by reviewer two as being a fantastic contribution, then of course it was all my idea. It was the way that I designed the experiment, which was responsible for the success. Okay, so this is just to show that even an implicit measure it seems to be capable of capturing this interesting way that our sense of agency is embedded in our wider affective life. Okay, I'm going to go fairly quickly through one more bit about what we've learned. So this is the original paper, which we published in 2002, and I think we started working on this in 2000, so a long time ago. And I worked on it for a bit, and then I moved away. I drifted off into other things. And now there's quite a big literature on this intentional binding effect. So there's about 230 papers in PubMed. And I sort of thought it might be interesting to look at it again. So I want to very briefly present a meta-analysis of 25 years of trying to use time perception to study sense of agency. So Prisma approach to meta-analysis found 74 usable studies, which included over 200 effect size estimates, 200 independent effect size estimates. For the action binding effect, that's the shift in the action towards the outcome, and for the outcome binding effect, that's the shift of the outcome back towards the action. And all of these experiments are all completely different. So people have used this method in patients, in human robotic interactions. There's lots of people trying to work out whether you have agency if you use AI, this kind of thing, lots of different factors. And the question is, can we try to get anything out of them? So normally what you do in meta-analysis is you pick an effect like, does aspirin treat headache, or does a drug work, or and this is a little bit different because what we're doing here is we're not studying an effect, we're studying a measure. And what we can do is we can ask, out of all of these different studies which have used the measure, what kinds of factors influence the binding measure? What is this sense of agency measure actually picking up on? What's it sensitive to? And if we can get an overview of what factors influence intentional binding, then this idea of selective influence could be useful for understanding SOA. So let's skip all of that. That's not interesting. Yeah, so the problem that you get here is that you've got very heterogeneous experimental data. So meta-analysis is designed really around RCTs for drugs, where you've got a pretty clear intervention that everybody gets 2 paracetamol in all the different experiments that have been done on paracetamol and headache. And that's not the case here. People have done different kinds of interventions. But what you need to do is try to classify using a sort of soft grouping across studies. So lots of different studies have compared an intentional condition to a less intentional condition. So they've compared intentional binding when I press a button versus, for example, when I watch you press the button. So it's more intentional when I press the button than it is when I watch you. And just to remind you, this is action binding and this is outcome binding. And if you look at these, now, is that me or is that somebody else?
I think it's you, yes.
What do I need to do?
Somebody else.
I've put my sound off. Across the 240 different estimates of action binding, this is the Hedges G, which is the average effect size estimate. It corresponds to 25 milliseconds. So there's a moderate effect size shift there. And outcome binding is always bigger, or in general, it's bigger. So you've got an effect size of minus 0.85, minus because it's in the opposite direction, and it's got a large effect size. And if you look at what factors influence action binding using a moderation meta-analysis, it turns out that the only thing that influences action binding is whether you have a voluntary motor command or not. So you get this binding of action towards outcome when you press the button and you don't otherwise. And nothing else seems to change that effect. Whereas if you look at outcome binding, it is influenced by whether it's a voluntary or involuntary movement. It's also influenced by outcome valence. It's also influenced by the outcome modality, whether it's visual or auditory. And it's also influenced by action outcome interval, which is your point about the temporal relation between action and outcome. So there's lots more things that influence outcome binding than influence action binding. And I think what we're driving towards here is that outcome binding is due to postdictive trying to make sense of the world. You just include all the information you've got. You integrate lots of different kinds of information coming from multiple different cognitive systems, and you try to link the outcome to the action that generated it. Whereas action binding just seems to depend on the physiological basis of whether there's a motor command leaving your motor cortex. It doesn't depend on anything else. There's a related attempt to do neuroimaging meta-analysis. Have I got another couple of minutes or should I wrap up?
No, I think.
Okay, all right. So in the same paper, we were quite interested in what's the brain mechanism? What's the brain mechanism here? And we looked in the neuroimaging literature, and nobody has done the intentional binding experiment in fMRI. As far as I can tell, there's no publication where people have actually done this particular experiment in fMRI, even though there's 250 behavioral experiments, which is quite odd, 250 behavioral papers. What people have done is they have looked at sense of agency with fMRIs. There's quite a lot of fMRI studies of sense of agency. And typically they're using explicit action attribution. So they're typically asking questions like, did you do that? Yes or no. So an event happens on the screen and the question is, was it you or was it the computer that made that happen? And what we're trying to do then is we're going to try to put together behavioral meta-analysis of intentional binding with neuroimaging meta-analysis of something else, of a different task, of a very different kind of measure. How are we going to do that? Well, what we can do is we can notice that the experimental manipulations in the neuroimaging literature are actually very similar to those in the intentional binding literature. So is there a voluntary motor command, present or absent? Is the outcome temporally predictable and temporally contiguous? Is the outcome nice or nasty? So we've got two completely different data types, for both of which people have done perhaps the obvious experiments that you might want to do in order to test a sense of agency. They've manipulated the same experimental factors in both traditions. So just to give an example of this is a paper by Chris Frith, where there's a cursor here that moves on the screen. It goes up this T-maze and then it has to follow towards the cross. And in one condition, the participant moves the cursor. In another condition, the experimenter moves the cursor, and the experimenter always moves the cursor away from the cross. So that's like it's not me, I'm not the agent, whereas this is a condition where you are the agent, and they also manipulated predictability. So that's just an example of a neuroimaging study which manipulates something like the sense of agency, but doesn't use the intentional binding effect. So the interesting kind of methodological question here is what happens when you get different data types, but similar experimental designs? How do we integrate that data? So we can't do it very quantitatively, but we can look for the particular factors, common design factors, which are across neuroimaging and binding studies, and then we can look at the two meta-analyses side by side. So in the neuroimaging meta-analysis, which is a standard ginger ale sort of analysis, if you look at the main effect of making a voluntary action versus not making a voluntary action in agency experiments, not surprisingly, you find motor cortical and subcortical networks, pre-SMA, which is a big area for intentional action, and then some others, including the cerebellum and the parietal cortex. In the neuroimaging literature, a lot of people looked at putting delays between action and outcomes. It's been a very, very popular manipulation. So if you put in a long delay between the action and the outcome, this is kind of like it's not yours. It's a manipulation of non-agency. And those studies always find a temporal parietal junction. So temporal parietal junction seems to be this big, it wasn't me kind of area in the brain. It seems to sort of be a denial of agency. And if we look at the effect of outcome valence, unsurprisingly, we find the putamen and the chordates, so striatum. So we can put those two things together. We can conclude that probably there are two bits of sense of agency. There are two mechanisms which are constantly working in parallel. There's the prediction on the basis of my intention and of my motor command of what's going to happen. And that corresponds to the action binding effect. And it seems to be rooted in the brain's motor areas, and it seems to be basically always there. It seems to be a stable effect. It's relatively small, but it doesn't change whatever else happens. So it's perhaps a modular circuit. On the other hand, you have this post-fiction on the basis of the outcome of, oh, that must have been me, which seems to require general cognition and parietal attention networks. It seems to be much more widely distributed across the brain, with perhaps a particular focus on the right temporoparietal junction. So what does it mean to be in control? I think it means to have both of these mechanisms. My guess is that the post-active mechanism is really important when things are difficult, when you're uncertain, when you're trying to learn new agency. And my guess is that when you know what you're doing, you can go through the world using the excellent predictions that your motor system and your faculty of association can give you. So just to conclude, sense of agency is a distinctive subjective experience. I think it's something that we all feel and is important. It's central to human existence and it can be studied scientifically. So there's nothing magic about it. I think decomposing sense of agency into subcomponents identifies two brain mechanisms for prediction and interpretation, respectively. There are big implications potentially for studying this. I think one of the perhaps positive implications of this research is that responsibility and law and ordered, well-functioning societies of individuals in control of their lives might not just be a trick or a lie or a conspiracy. It might actually be a reflection of how our brains work. And the idea that we're individually responsible for our actions has a basis in our everyday subjective experience and also in our brain, particularly in the motor predictive circuitry of the brain. And I don't think we need to be just social constructivists about the legal system and about responsibility. Or put another way, I think the kinds of action networks we have in our brain are one of the conditions of responsibility of a legal system. The last time I gave this talk, it was to a set of people who didn't care a damn about sense of agency. So I put three general conclusions, which might be interesting even if you don't care. And these are just things, I guess, that I've learned about studying the mind experimentally, which are of general interest. One is that it really is worth using implicit measures. They really do help. The second is it's really interesting to use meta-analysis, not just to ask whether an effect is stable, but to try to integrate a group across loosely defined effects. So there's a kind of fluffy meta-analysis, which is more fluffy than rigorous meta-analysis, but also interesting for heterogeneous studies. And I think finally, this idea of selective influence, there are some factors which will influence a measure. Selective influence and sensitivity analysis are a very good way to study how something works. Thanks very much for your attention.